Over the past decade, Japan has transformed itself into the destination for the biggest money signings in rugby union. However, it was recently announced that star All Black fly half Richie Mo'unga will end his 3-year exile in Japan to return home to play in New Zealand. The news comes as rumours persist that star Springboks Cheslin, Kolbe and Pieter-Steph Toit are seeking returns to the URC. Is this just the ebb and flow of rugby transfers, or is there a broader trend starting to emerge? To learn more about the greater market forces influencing Japanese rugby, I spoke to journalists Ben Jaycock and Stephen Noble.
Steve, I hope don't mind me asking, but I was quite surprised last summer when Japan played England in Tokyo. Obviously, England coming to town. You've got Marcus Smith, Maro Itoje, real household names in the rugby world, but there were 25,000 empty seats in Tokyo. I mean, it had large swathes of vacant sections. I know the cost of living crisis and a lack of promotion was to blame, but were you quite surprised by that attendance figure?
Surprised, but I also think since that final you mentioned, which I think broke a record in Japan, there have been a decline in attendances. This season has been notable for that domestically in the JRLO. I've heard and I've spoken to a lot of people and sources about the reasons for that. But that test match was the first kind of red flag if you go back to a year ago. And it happened again, I think, with the All Blacks. I don't think that match sold out in Japan. And if you look at who Japan is playing coming up in the summer, with no disrespect to Wales, they've got Wales for the first 2 games at home. Now, those are going to be games that Japan will be targeting to win. And they haven't beaten consistently top 12, top 15 countries in the world since Eddie Jones has really stepped into that role. But I think those concerns about attendances are going to be coming to the head again if they don't get good attendances for these upcoming internationals. And it's not just the internationals. Japan is hosting New Zealand kind of schoolboys and Maori teams. There's a lot of tours coming through at the same time, which you think would get crowds excited. But at the moment, there are these little red flags popping up. Two of the reasons, if you want to get into the weeds of it, the two main consistent reasons I've heard of why attendances have dropped off this last season, and maybe this is true of any country, because the national team hasn't performed as well over the last 12 to 18 months. There's been a dip in crowd enthusiasm or attendances, which I think is fair maybe for any country. And then secondly, there's the arguments within the JRLO, whether the influx of all these international players has turned the local crowd slightly off watching the league. I don't know if that second point is as valid, but I can believe the first one. Obviously, they were breaking records and riding high when post 2019, when they beat Scotland and Ireland and made their first ever quarter final. And unfortunately, we had the pandemic straight after that. If that hadn't have happened, I think we'd even be further ahead of where we are now. But I think those two main points are what I'm hearing consistently this last season.
You always just think of Japan as an incredibly rich country and so far ahead, but I was fascinated to read about the cost of living crisis, the highest inflation rate for 41 years, putting pressure on households to manage their expenses, stagnant wages and a weak yen are further exacerbating the problem.
I do think the cost of living, not just Japan, globally, especially this year with all the tariff uncertainty, I think there are those reality checks. There's maybe a question mark over broadcast of games, because domestically in Japan, I think a lot of the games are watchable via domestic streaming services. Internationally, this season's probably slightly less than the previous season. I don't know what the reasons for that are. I do think the cost of living is genuine. I was looking at, because Japan's become incredibly popular for tourism, right? Especially this last year, because the yen has dropped so much. And I was looking at the comparative rates when I was there in 2019 compared to what it is now. And I think it was easily like 30% down. So if it was 30% cheaper for foreigners to go there, yeah, great destination. But if you're still earning the same kind of income in Japan, then obviously you're going to have to tighten those budgets.
Can you point about the financial stability of the league? I think I'm fascinated in that as a topic about rugby all over the world. And I think it's an interesting point where in France and England, you have these sugar daddy clubs of an incredibly rich backer is backing the club, and one day they might keel over and then all the money's gone. In Japan, it's a different thing because you don't have one person owning the club, but like you said, that with the yen struggling, someone like Toshiba or whoever it may be might go, we need to cut some costs here. Hang on a minute, why are we spending this much money on these three New Zealand rugby players. Let's get rid of those. That'll save a bunch of money. It could change drastically very quickly.
I feel, and again, I don't see the numbers, so it's just my guesswork. I feel like it's something I think the league, and I'm sure their chairman and executives who look after the league consider these things, and they're smarter people than I am, and they're talking to the club owners or the companies that own these clubs. But I think that is my biggest concern. I mean, like I said, where else in the world do you see expansion of leagues? I think Japan must be the only place. And if you combine that with the fact that attendances are down this year, there's, like Ben mentioned, the financial struggles of maybe the average person in Japan, and all these things kind of, for me, layer up on top of each other. And I just think there should be hopefully some restrictions, or hopefully there is some checks and balances going on to make sure they're not overspending. And I hope they aren't. But like I said, the fact is they're going to expand again, not next season, but the season after. So it is going to be interesting.